to introduce Scott Gehlbach. He's a professor of in Department of Political Science at Harris School of Public Policy in the University of Chicago. So he runs a relatively new program on political economy in a PhD program in political economy at the University of Chicago. So he had enormous contributions in policy science, political economy. I highly recommend his books, especially his book on models of domestic politics, with a new edition last year, 2021, I guess. Okay, so it's and again many super interesting contributions. So today he will be talking about contact, threat, and violence in political upheld anti-Jewish pogroms in the 1905 Russian Revolution. And I also want to remind you that he's going to be giving the memorial lecture tomorrow, 4 p.m. here. Also, you can follow on Zoom, and he will be talking about governing autocratic regimes. So I'm also expecting another awesome presentation by Scott. So Scott, such a pleasure that you are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you. That in Chicago. Here, I might have to stop staring again. Turn the camera on. Okay, we'll start this again. It's all going. We good? Think so.
Are you recording?
We're recording. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, David.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so let me introduce my co-authors. Paul Bauer is maybe know some of these people know. Paul Bauer is a development economist and an economic historian at Wisconsin. Dmitry Kafanov is my former student at Wisconsin, now at the University of Barcelona. Steve Knapziger is an economic historian of Russia. So, okay, good. So this is a paper about political change and local violence. And so let me make some general statements to start this off. So in general, momentous political change, so think revolutions, coups, watershed elections, constitutional changes, produce losers as well as winners. And among those losers, there's often a feeling of a political threat that accompanies that change. Those feelings of political threat, often magnified by rumors and propaganda, produce local violence. Local violence that is often targeted at ethnic and religious groups that are associated with that political change. We're interested in asking which communities are most vulnerable to such violence when it accompanies political change of that sort. So you could imagine two different effects. So on the one hand, it's possible that feelings of political threat are magnified when the groups associated with that threat are relatively large. So this is a perspective that we might associate with what's sometimes called group threat theory. On the other hand, you might think that the vulnerability to propaganda and rumors is diminished when the groups that are associated with change are relatively large. So this we could associate with what's sometimes called contact theory. So when there's more contact between individuals of different ethnic and religious groups, then there's less fertile ground for stereotypes or prejudice or whatever to take root. So we would argue that existing work does little to adjudicate among these competing hypotheses. Existing work that examines the relationship between political threat and local violence tends to treat such a threat as static. Work that examines contact between different groups really isn't focused on the empirical setting that we're interested in. It's the sort of more typical intervention is you randomize college students to room with somebody from the same ethnic group or different ethnic group, and like that's interesting, but that's not That's not our question. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? So in this paper, we're going to examine the impact of political change, which in our context is revolution, on local violence, which in our context is anti-Jewish pogroms during the 1905 Russian Revolution. So this is just a quick reminder. What was the 1905 Russian Revolution? Russia started, this is going to sound terribly familiar. Russia started a stupid war, it proceeded to lose. And that was followed by political upheaval over the course of 1904, 1905. There were hundreds of anti-Jewish pogroms during this period as part of this general political upheaval. And an important piece of context here is that during this period, fairly and unfairly, Jews are associated for many with radical politics. So some of the radical political groups have Jewish leaders. Jews then in total come to be associated with radical politics, and that creates fertile ground for scapegoating. So in particular, we're going to exploit the shock to feelings of political threat that accompanied the October Manifesto. So the October Manifesto was essentially forced on Tsar Nicholas II in 1905, following a general strike earlier in the month. Through the October Manifesto, the Tsar essentially surrendered what had been centuries of absolute authority held by the monarchy. So there were guarantees of political and civil liberties, the promise of a constitution, the creation of a Duma, a legislature, and so forth. And this is viewed as a positive thing by many of those who are pushing for political change, but not by other segments of Russian society. So rightists, monarchists, some of the very same workers who had been pushing for some sort of change earlier in the month, who had participated in the general strike that had forced the Tsar's hand, responded negatively to the promises in the October Manifesto. So the workers in particular, they were striking for better working conditions. That's not what they got, and at least it's not what they could expect to get in the short run. What they got instead was a loss of authority by a Tsar, who many of them had affection for. So you sort of think of these individuals as sort of culturally conservative workers who were hoping for economic change and not the political change that they got. And so this produced a backlash that expressed itself in anti-Jewish pogroms, especially in the month following the publication of the October Manifesto. So there was a big spike in pogroms in November 1905. So we're interested in examining the change in pogrom incidence in Jewish settlements with relatively large and relatively small Jewish populations. To do that, we're going to use a geocoded sample of 1,356 Jewish settlements in the Pale of Settlement, so the part of the Western Russian Empire, the area to which Jewish residence was generally limited. And we're going to use newly digitized data on religious composition of those settlements from the 1897 Russian census. So the first real census of the Russian population. There had been tax censuses of one sort or another prior to that, but this is the first real census of the general population. Okay, so in brief, what do we find? We find a smaller increase in pogroms post-October 1905, where the Jewish community was relatively large. So if you like, this is consistent with contact theory and inconsistent with group threat theory. This is a very robust result. So this association, it's not confounded by weather shocks, we allow for differential trends by province, by numerous settlement level characteristics. The result stands up. It's not driven by diffusion or contagion, whatever you want to call it, modeled in various ways. And it's robust to conditioning on the prior incidents of pogroms into the composition of the non-Jewish population. So Catholic versus Protestant versus Orthodox. We find, in addition, that the within settlement effect of Jewish share is larger where Jews and non-Jews were more likely to interact across settlements. So there seems to be some complementarity between contact within Jewish settlements and what we understand to be contact across settlements. We also find some suggestive evidence that the effect of Jewish share is larger where Jews lived alongside Catholics as opposed to Orthodox Christians or Protestants. Okay. That's where we're going. Okay, so let me tell you how we get there. So there's a related work. I don't want to dwell on this, but just mention that there are two other papers and one book that directly examine the relationship between anti-Jewish pogroms in different contexts. So this is in occupied Poland during World War II. This is Kristallnacht in Germany. So they find a positive relationship between Jewish share and the incidence of anti-Jewish pogroms. The one thing I want to say about that work relative to ours is that both of these are cross-sectional designs. They don't exploit the sort of shock that we have that arguably gives us better identification. Okay, so what we know probably all of this. What is Russia in the early 20th century? It's an autocratic state. There's a pervasive climate of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of religious diversity within the pale of settlement, and to some extent we'll exploit that diversity beyond just the distinction between Jews and non-Jews. There are regular cross-group interactions, especially through economic transactions, and in particular, what the historical literature emphasizes is that a lot of these cross-group interactions took place within shtetls, so the traditional market towns with substantial Jewish populations. That's a distinction that we'll examine in the paper, so we're able to administratively identify with a bit of noise what the shtetls are versus other types of settlements. The period that we focus on, this is the second of three major waves of anti-Jewish pogroms. So there's one in the early 1880s and then one following the Russian Revolution as well. Okay, so what happened in 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906? So after a period in which there were not major Jewish pogroms for some substantial period of time, there were two large pogroms in 1903, one in Chisinau in April, on Easter Sunday. This is a sort of traditional blood libel sort of pogrom, and then one in Gomel later in the year. Then frequent occurrences beginning the following year. Some of the pogroms in 1904 are driven by mobilization of men into the Russian army to fight in the Russo-Japanese War, and backlash to that, and then further into 1905. And then, as I mentioned, there's this massive surge following the publication of the October Manifesto in October 1905. So there were over 250 pogroms just in November, and then it settles down again, and this wave ends by the middle of 1906. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this. So in general, we can think of sort of two stories that might help us to form some priors about what sort of communities are most vulnerable to increased political threat of the sort that we think is associated with the October Manifesto. Maybe one thing to emphasize here is that in the historical literature, I think, if this paper does nothing else, I think it makes a historical contribution, in that I'm not sure that historians understand what the relationship is between the relative size of the Jewish community and the actual incidence of pogroms during this period. So Mark Steinberg, who's a historian of Russia at Illinois, writes in particular that where Jews were a large part of a city's local population, right-wing violence reached extremes. And that, again, is not what we find. Jessica? Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm just thinking.
So something that we're not going to get at today, but we'd like to get at with future work is the idea that contact between individuals from different ethnic or religious groups may be more likely to prevent violence when there's occupational complementarity among those groups. And that's something that we think that we can get at eventually with data that we haven't looked at yet, but it's not going to be part of the presentation today. I mean, I think sort of the main takeaway here is that going into this project, if anything, we might have thought that the October Manifesto would have produced a larger spike in anti-Jewish pogroms in communities with relatively large Jewish populations, given not only what the historiography says, but maybe kind of the absence of some of the scope conditions for contact among groups to reduce violence among those groups. So this is not an environment with equal status among groups, or in which there is the support of authorities for reduced violence and so forth. But again, that's not what we find. We find quite the opposite. Okay, so so what do we do in the paper? So we have several data sources for this exercise. Yanai Spitzer at Hebrew University for his dissertation work, which is still unpublished, but which he's graciously given to us. He's given to us a couple of data, couple of variables that he's collected. One is a geolocation, a set of geolocated data set of geolocated pogroms from 1904 to 1906. So this is ultimately based on the work of primarily of a single historian who documented pogroms during this period. Yanai's contribution was to geolocate those individual pogroms and then to borrow from a few other sources as well. So anybody's seen this paper by Grossfeld et al. On pogroms over all three of these waves? The data are similar to that paper, but a little bit more expansive than what's in the Grossfeld et al. Paper. So from Yanai, we also have the geolocation of all settlements or almost all settlements in the Pale of Settlement with substantial Jewish communities. My co-author, Dmitry Kafanov, geolocated imperial railroad maps for his dissertation work. Interestingly, this is a time-varying variable, even over the very short period that we examine, because there's substantial railroad construction that's taking place even during the Russo-Japanese War, even in Western Russia. We digitized data from the 1897 census on the religious composition of all Jewish settlements in the Pale of Settlement. And so in particular, the 1897 census gives us the share of the population in a settlement belonging to different religious groups, as long as that share exceeds 10%. Okay, so this is an important caveat to what we're doing. So there are some of the communities in Yanai's data set in which the Jewish share is below 10%. And so we don't know whether that's 2 or 9 or whatever. And so those are smaller Jewish communities overwhelmingly. They make up a very small percentage of the total Jewish population of the Pale. And so we just drop those from the data set. Okay, so this gives you a sense of the pogrom data. So you have pogroms 1904, 1905. There's this big spike in November 1905, and then it drops off pretty quickly after that. And these take place, there's a little bit of, there are repeat pogroms even within months, but also across months. So we're going to be interested, so we're just going to be interested in the incidence of a pogrom in a particular settlement in a particular month. So if there's more than one pogrom, for now we're just treating that as there was a pogrom in in that settlement. Okay. So this map shows us the geographic distribution of Jewish communities and pogroms across the Pale of Settlement. So just to get oriented, this is geography that we're all a lot more familiar with now than we were just 6 months ago, right? So much of contemporary Ukraine, all of contemporary Belarus, some of the Baltics. And so I think the main takeaway from this map is that pogroms, which are the red circles, so Jewish communities are scaled by the size of the Jewish population. Those are the blue circles. And pogroms are the red circles on the map. Pogroms are distributed. I mean, there's a little bit of clustering, but they're all over the Pale of Settlement. In particular, there's a lot of basically every province on the map features multiple pogroms. Okay, so we're interested in the relationship between the relative size of the Jewish population in a settlement and the incidence of pogroms in that settlement. There's a lot of variation in Jewish share, and that's true even if we focus on particular types of communities. So urban settlements, meaning provincial capitals or other large towns, Miasteczka, which is an administrative category that roughly corresponds to shtetl, and then rural communities. Interesting that even within this category, which are predominantly shtetls, we see communities with just over 10% Jewish share, and then communities that are predominantly Jewish. And so this map just shows the so this is the variation that we're going to identify off of. So this is the share of Jews controlling for province fixed effects population and type of settlement. And so you can see that there's a lot of variation across the map in the relative size of the Jewish population. So the more green, the less purple it is, the larger the Jewish community within some zone. Okay, this is not research design. These are just correlations. Okay, so this just shows that this is the sort of thing that maybe some previous work has done. So if we were to just regress pogrom incidents on various covariates, what we would see is that pogroms are more likely in communities with relatively large Jewish populations. They're less likely in shtetls. Yeah, I'll talk more about some of these other variables a little bit later. Okay, but we're interested in the relationship between, we're interested in how this increased political threat manifests itself in different communities. And so it's that shock to the political threat that we're really interested in focusing on. Okay, so the basic research design then is differences in differences regression, in which the outcome of interest is the incidence of a pogrom in settlement S in province T, so settlements are nested within provinces or gubernias, at province P in month T, where the effect of interest is the is this variable kappa. So the coefficient on the interaction between the Jewish share of a settlement and a dummy variable for the post-October 1905 period. Okay. So we're going to allow for differential trends by a lot of different things. So this we're I mean, it's a difference in differences design in that we're including settlement fixed effects and time fixed effects. But in addition, we're going to allow trends in pogrom incidents to vary by province. So we're going to include a full set of, sorry, this is not quite right in terms of notation, but we're going to include a full set of interactions between province fixed effects and our indicator for the post-October period. We're going to control for temperature and precipitation deviations to be sure we're not just picking up weather shocks. We're going to, in some regressions, interact those deviations with this dummy variable for the post-October period. And we're going to consider other interactions of time invariant characteristics, like whether this is an urban settlement or mistechka in the population of the settlement, again, with this indicator for the post-October period. Bottom line is we're soaking up a lot of variation, not just through the settlement fixed effects and the time fixed effects, but we're also allowing these trends to vary by lots of characteristics. So we're interested in diversity, or sorry, in contagion, or what's the other word that I'm looking for?
Diffusion.
Sorry?
Diffusion.
Diffusion, thank you. And so in some regressions, we're going to include a spatial lag of pogroms, where that lag takes a value of 1 if a settlement is within 50 kilometers of the unit of observation and 0 otherwise. We're going to allow that to vary pre versus post. And I'm going to show you results in which we report Conley standard errors that allow for correlation of errors both spatially and temporally. We'll assume a 50-kilometer radius and a 2-period lag. Okay, that's the basic design. Questions about that?
So this is great, but just in the interest of time, we want to
so
we have a lot of time to
can
do.
you wrap up? And
Are
sometimes
we saving the saving the questions for the end?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I've been waiting for questions, and so I'm like, you're such a
Start piling it.
polite audience. I'm used to.
I will start the queue, so whoever wants to start.
Sorry, I'm used to the Chicago. Yeah, I'm used to questions
worry.
from the slides. So.
Yeah,
Oral argument, you get 5 minutes in, forget it.
You're just sharpening the knife.
That's right.
I had no idea. Okay, I'm okay. So, okay.
Okay, so but
Do you have a question now, or?
I was actually like, can you wrap up in maybe 2 or 3 minutes? Maybe show some tables.
We can just start,
and then
maybe the discussions will lead to more of your results, whatever you prefer, Scott. It's up to you.
Me 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
5. Okay,
Sorry, I had no idea. I thought.
Yes. Okay, good. I will start with the queue. Okay.
Okay.
Those that are online, it's like we'll start with the queue. So it's like you just put it in the chat.
Okay. This is the main. Okay, these are the main results. So let's spend a minute or 2 on this. Okay. So this shows the relationship between this and the next couple of slides. Let's see. So this shows the differential effect, the relative effect of Jewish share, change in pogrom incidents pre versus post October 1905 in communities with relatively large and relatively small Jewish populations. Okay, and so as we've discussed, this the estimated effect is negative. So it's relatively large in magnitude. So a 1 standard deviation increase in Jewish share is associated with a decrease in pogrom incidence of approximately half the mean. This is the associated event study. So the effect takes place really entirely in November 1905. So there's if anything, a positive effect relative to the immediate month preceding the October Manifesto, in other months in the period, but this large negative effect of Jewish share in the month immediately after the publication of the October Manifesto. These are sensitivity plots using a method developed by Chad Hazlitt at UCLA. The basic idea is to ask if there's some unobserved confounder, even conditioning on all of this other stuff, there's some unobserved confounder that's correlated with both the treatment and the outcome, how correlated would that confounder have to be with the treatment and the outcome to, well, we could set different benchmarks, but let's say to reduce the effect size by 1/2 that we estimate. Okay, and we can think of this in terms of how correlated would that confounder have to be with the treatment and the outcome relative to things that we do see in the data. So say relative to the interaction between population and the post indicator, which is quite correlated with pogrom incidence. And so even if we assumed that some unobserved confounder or confounders were 3 times as correlated with the treatment and the outcome as the population post indicator interaction is, we'd still be well short of what we would need to be in order to reduce the estimated effect size by 1/2. So basic takeaway here is that the results are unlikely to be driven by unobserved confounders. Okay, robust to lots of different things. So different ways of measuring weather shocks, measuring contagion, not just through spatial lags, which we do in some of these earlier regressions, but by looking at means of diffusion, such as proximity to railroads or proximity to provincial capitals. Those variables work the way that you might expect, but it doesn't affect the baseline results. This isn't driven by just some, it's not just driven by sort of the exhaustion of communities with larger Jewish populations. It's not like pogroms have worked their way through communities with larger Jewish populations before November 1905. And so when you get this spike, then it's the other communities that are affected. So even controlling for prior incidents in pogroms, we see the same sort of results. It's not driven by variation within the non-Jewish community. Yeah, and so that's all, I mean, the bottom line is this seems to be pretty robust. Let me skip this. Just say 2 other things. Just to close the loop on something that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. So first is that all of this, everything that I've shown you so far, essentially assumes that interaction between Jews and non-Jews takes place only within a particular settlement. But we know from the historiography that there's lots of interaction between Jews and non-Jews across settlements. There are stories in the historiography about the instigating role of outsiders, and outsiders, they get on a train, they go to one community, they collect a bunch of people, they go to the next community, they collect some more, and at the end of the line, they get off, and that's where the pogrom happens. So you might ask how the incidence of pogroms relates to the interaction between Jews and non-Jews across and not just within settlements. And so to examine this, we use, this is recent work by Sofia Correa and Daniel Hodgman. They axiomatically derive a measure of segregation. It's based upon the idea that in our case, communities are more segregated if Jews live close to other Jews and don't live close to other non-Jews. Okay, and so this then just allows for the effect of our the basic differential effect of Jewish share pre versus post October 1905 to vary according to the segregation of communities, the extent to which Jews and non-Jews presumably interact across communities based upon their distance of communities from each other and the relative size of Jewish and non-Jewish communities. And so the way to read this is that settlements that are less segregated, so in which Jews and non-Jews are more likely to interact across space, across settlements, those settlements see an even larger negative effect of Jewish share than in those that are segregated. So there seems to be some complementarity between the interaction of Jews and non-Jews across settlements and their interaction within settlements. Okay, let me wrap up. Let me not present this and just say that there's more that we want to do. So this is still very early days for this paper. Yeah, I think one thing that I'm really sort of especially interested in doing going forward, that maybe is the next thing that we'll be doing, is to be matching our data on Jewish settlements with the location of factories in the late in late Imperial Russia. And the idea here is that, again, the literature on the period emphasizes that there was this backlash by industrial workers who thought they were protesting or striking for one thing in October 1905, and then they got something else. And so you might think that the proximity to different types of industrial establishments and the nature of those industrial establishments, the extent to which they're unskilled versus skilled workers could matter. And so that's something that we'll be looking at going forward. Okay, great. So on that note, I look forward to your questions and everything that everybody has been saving up. So
good.
Yeah.
So I have Shes and then Ken, and I will keep with the queue. So if you want to ask questions,
Such a
Shes.
quiet audience.
Great. Well, so my first, this is really interesting, and the data is fascinating, and it seems like you're doing a lot with it. One question I have is make sure that I have the central argument that it is a contact theory is what you think is happening. Yes, generally, plus or minus.
Consistent with that.
Okay, consistent with that. From epidemiological models, though, contact is maximized at 50%. And so the question is, why would we expect contact to be maximized the greater the share? It should be non-monotonic, right? So one question is that something that I miss in the data? Are you squaring the term somewhere?
It's something that I skipped over in the interest of time, but let's talk about that. Okay, yeah. So Jessica's right in that so this is right that like much of the literature emphasizes essentially two-sided contact. So there's a literature on heterogeneity, religious or ethnic heterogeneity and conflict that suggests that such conflict will be greatest when you have two equally sized communities. So that's when contact between any two individuals would be greatest. And so potentially conflict could be larger or smaller in that case, but contact would be maximized in that case. And I think the cross-country literature suggests that the relationship is positive. So you generally see a positive relationship between polarization, which is maximized when you have two equally sized communities, and conflict measured at the cross-country level. So what that perspective implicitly assumes, we believe, is that conflict is two-sided, that there's, in our context, that Jews and non-Jews could be equally likely to initiate a conflict with each other. Whereas in our context, it's non-Jews initiating conflict with Jews that is the salient form of conflict. And in that context, then the question we would want to ask is, how likely is it that any non-Jew would come into contact with a Jew? And the measure of that probability is the proportion or the share of the Jewish community.
Two follow-ups to that. One, I don't know anything about how exactly pogroms were carried out. So I'm curious about how that mechanism, like, if you can elaborate on that part. But the other part is, if the mechanism of so I guess one question I have is, what is the nature of the mechanism at work in the way that you're thinking about contact theory here? Because to me, what I gathered, and I apologize if I sort of didn't go quite into as much detail as I wanted to in the reading, was that if they interact, that contact essentially exposes you to different groups, and therefore you're more comfortable with them, et cetera, and therefore you're less likely to kill them. If that is the mechanism, then it's, so you still, right? So how small does the group have to, how small does the non-Jew group have to be to carry out a pogrom? Or how large does the non-Jew group have to be to carry out a pogrom? Because if they can be sufficiently small and they're still willing to engage in that, then the theory makes sense. But if it has to be a sufficiently large number of people in order to sufficiently carry out a pogrom that makes it into the data set, then I would still think the 50% threshold makes sense.
Okay, good. So I think that what this conversation is getting at is that there may be two things that we need to think about. So one is, what's the visibility, say, of the targeted group, and that visibility is, or say the visibility or the contact with the targeted group is greater to the extent that the targeted group is relatively large. But then second, what's the likelihood that any spark, say, could then turn into some sort of conflagration? And so that's going to be increasing. That's that second piece of this. You can think of as essentially the number of draws that you might get, which would be greater the larger the community is. Okay. So we glossed over this, but one thing that is important in terms of thinking about this differential effect is the fact that we're presumably getting more draws when the population is relatively large. And so everything that we're doing here allows for differential trends by population size. And as we can see, the increase in pogrom incidence post October 1905 versus pre-October 1905 is substantially greater in communities that are relatively large. Okay. So just one more thing about this. We think this is the right way of thinking about this theoretically in the context of one-sided conflict, but we could do what the existing literature does and look at not the share of the targeted group, but this is measure of fractionalization or polarization. So variable that's maximized when Jews and non-Jews are equal sizes as an alternative measure of conflict. In there, we don't see any relationship.
So, given that we are running out of time, we'll start taking questions in pairs. So, Ken, Dean, can you go?
Actually, my question was very similar to Jess's, which was, you can't have a program if you only have one Jew. You're not likely to have a program if 99% are Jews. It's got to be non-linear somewhere in between, but it's not clear to me that it would be at 50% where contact is greatest, because you don't attack a group that's larger than you. Just sort of military history suggests always look for a numbers advantage. And if this is a violent interaction, that might make a good model. So it seems to me that issue of non-linearity is extraordinarily important in trying to model what is it that explains the interaction. It's while share of Jews is important, it's not at all clear to me would expect that to be linear. And I didn't initially catch that it was non-linear. So that's not so much as a question as just saying you answered my question, I think.
Ting?
Yeah, I have a couple points. One is from reading the paper and your discussion, I really have no idea what a pogrom is, who perpetrated, which groups, was it military, was it citizens, did they kill people, burn buildings, both, aim for leaders? And this is all seems to be hugely important because in your data, you're treating each pogrom as an identical unit. I can't believe that that is true. And the other thing is I have no idea who gains and loses from this. So I have no idea what your hypothesis is. You know, it looks like, you know, I don't want to say this, some people might say, it looks like you got this data and you're trying to squeeze some stuff out of it. But the data is very limiting. You don't know who the leaders of these, I mean, you suggest in your narrative that, you know, they targeted Jews as scapegoats, they were leaders of political groups, but do we know if they went after these people in particular? Were they killed? Were they targeted? So I don't know I don't honestly know what to make of this at the end of the day in terms of understanding.
Okay, good. So we're leaning a lot on our very preliminary draft, which I wasn't aware that that actually that was the format of the seminar. But so let me say a little bit about the nature of the pogroms, and then I just want to circle back very briefly to the question of these are citizens and sort of everyday citizens and not soldiers that are carrying out the pogroms. Pogroms substantially involve property damage. There's also some loss of life, in the hundreds in total across November 1905 in particular. But it's destruction of Jewish shops, Jewish residences. You know, that's the primary form that these take, and again with some loss of life. I think like the Kishinev pogrom in 1903 is a particular pogrom that has been written about a lot. So we sort of know the dynamics of that pogrom maybe better than some of the others. There was local anti-Semitic newspaper that had been publishing various incendiary allegations. Those then produced a climate that resulted in pogrom activity that eventually brought in individuals from surrounding communities to take part. So circling back to the question of measurement for a second. So it's true that you can't have or want to have a pogrom that we would pick up in the data in a community with only a few Jews, but those are not the communities in our sample. So our sample is communities identified as Jewish in Spitzer's work, and again for reasons of measurement, because we're using data from the 1897 census, which doesn't give us the population of religious groups if they fall under 10%. These are all communities in which Jews constitute at least 10%.
I think I have Andrew and then Brian, you are online, and I will check people that are asking questions on the chat in the meantime, okay?
Yeah, I have two quick questions, and the first is about the 1897 census, and I was just kind of wondering how reliable is it? You mentioned it was the first one, so I was wondering what the potential is for errors in the data collection, and also whether there were incentives to lie on the census, and particularly about the religious affiliation. And then also secondly, in the conclusion of the draft, you mentioned that you were thinking of exploring some of the heterogeneous effects of Jewish share, especially in relation to religious composition and social organization. I was wondering what your hypotheses were with respect to those two additional variables.
Good. So the answer,
Let me,
oh, sorry.
can I pick up a couple of questions? Yes. So Brian, can you go with your questions?
Thank you. Interesting. So comment and a question. In terms of motivation, I think contemporary, you might mention the relevance to places like, for example, Nigeria, where you do have outbreaks of mass violence related to ethnic groups. And in that case, you also have a whole set of variations in proportions of communities. The question, and I may not be able to understand the answer, but is the time series looks like an avalanche, or somebody mentioned, or a nonlinear process, crossing a threshold or whatever. And just to ask, to what extent does that have implications either for your analysis, or again, more generally for thinking about how outbreaks of mass violence occur? Thank you. That's posted in the chat too.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, so Andrew's
Yes.
question. So, I think our sense is that this is probably it's a period when individuals from different religious groups could be identified fairly clearly from part of town that they lived in, from their names, from their dress and so forth. And so it's not like in later periods where groups that are discriminated against might more easily pass as somebody from a different religious group. And so, so probably that minimizes the sort of measurement error I'm concerned about. So in the draft that you saw, we wrote that we wanted to look at heterogeneous effects by the nature of religious heterogeneity. So since we wrote that draft, we have done that. And so that's what these regressions do. So here we allow the treatment effect to vary by the share of the non-Jewish population, or share of the population that's Catholic, the share that's Protestant, where the reference category here is the share that's predominantly Russian Orthodox. So the result is that the relative decrease, so that the fact that the increase in pogrom incidence is smaller in communities with relatively large Jewish populations, that effect is magnified to the extent that the non-Jewish community is Catholic as opposed to Orthodox or Protestant. And so I don't really have a good story as to why there would be that difference between Catholic and Protestant populations, but I think relative to Christian Orthodoxy, the obvious story here is that the Tsar represents not just autocracy, but orthodoxy. This is like the sort of throughout the 19th, the sort of official ideology of the late Imperial Russia was orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality in that order. And so any loss in authority by the Tsar would be reasonably interpreted as a loss of authority for the Orthodox Church as well, which might explain why Orthodox Christians are more likely to respond to that than Catholics are. And
So Brian
had a question about, sorry, it was in the chat.
So something about motivation.
Oh, it was an avalanche. It was an
The avalanche.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this goes back. My computer has stopped work. I think we just lost. So this isn't active anymore. So I mean, I think maybe this goes back to the event studies. You might think the fact that we're just picking up that there's such a predominance of pogroms in November 1905 might suggest that it would be difficult to estimate the other effects pre and post, but in fact those are pretty precisely estimated. So I don't know. There's maybe something more substantive to say about that. I think in terms of what actually happened, the in a lot of these communities, there was the sort of initial pogrom activity. Local authorities were slow to respond, but eventually military units were called out, and so that's what brought the pogroms ultimately to an end.
So I think I have a question, I think, related to this. Is like, it's, again, so the empirical paper is about, so you want just to check for the two different hypotheses, so the differential effects of size groups, okay? So it's okay. But still you may think about, so the theory of what drives the demand of these things, essentially, and then what drives the de-escalation, essentially. So it's because somehow with the information that you provided, it was kind of relatively reasonable for me to build a theory of demand. So well, there is a kind of complicated situation. There is this demand for kind of more traditional orthodox values. Okay, but why the escalation later? No, so essentially, what disappears is why it doesn't persist for more time. Okay, so it's I think that's what makes that kind of avalanche thing so complicated. Maybe that's, I don't know. So what happens at the end of the war? That's changed things. So there's no more mobilization activities, and that essentially the demand disappear. So trying to think of what hints we get for a theory of how political change generate the demand for violence, and what changes happen later for the escalation. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the war is over by this point. And so, like,
Okay.
to the extent that pogroms are being driven by mobilization, that ceased to become a factor by November 1905. Again, I think the best answer I have to why the escalation comes to an end so quickly is just simply that as sympathetic as the Tsar might have been to the response of those who were participating in the pogroms, ultimately the disorder was a threat to political stability, and so it was brought to an end by through force.
Okay. Do we have more questions?
101 as well.
Yes, just one more. Maybe, yes, you
Last question.
Yes.
Anybody else have
Even though we started like 5 minutes late.
Okay. Do you have economic data at the settlement level for sort of the shtetls and potentially the sort of productivity? I'm sort of thinking about whether there's the possibility that essentially you didn't want to destroy a bunch of property, et cetera, in the most productive or potentially most valuable shtetls. That would be more consistent with a more
So I
linear.
think that the closest we could probably get is the proximity of some sort of industrial enterprise. Something
Kind of where.
something that we're doing.
What minute you want to wrap up?
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for coming.
And come to the lecture tomorrow.
Next door.
Music, right?
4 o'clock tomorrow. Yes. We announced it at the beginning. So thank you for those that follow online. See you tomorrow, 4 p.m.
Tomorrow. Please encourage.
Sorry, we didn't have more time.